My name is Barbara Shannon. Today is March 26, 1981. I am here in the library at Bethany College, Lindsborg, Kansas, for the first of two interviews with Ethel Glad. Ethel lives at 635 North Main Street in Apartment 6 in Lindsborg, Kansas. This life review process will take the form of an informal visit. Hello, Ethel.
Hello there, Barbara. How are you today?
Just fine. We're going to have an enjoyable time thinking back over your life this afternoon. First of all, I'd like to know where and when you were born and who your parents were.
Well, I was born in Kansas City, Kansas, December 14th, 1899. And my father's name was Olaf Julen, and my mother's name was Amanda Sophia Carlson before she married my father. And my father didn't have but that one name, Olaf, and that was all he was known by, was Olaf.
So you are a real Swede from both sides.
I am a real Swede, and we spoke Swedish all the time at home. I didn't know how to speak English until I went to school.
That's an interesting background. What were some of the earliest memories that you have of your childhood?
Well, I have so many happy memories, but I remember one most exciting time, and that was when I was 4 years old, and my mother had been very ill, and the doctor had something that I had never heard of before or since. He called it water on the lung. But he said that my mother had to be out in the sunshine and the air and not breathe in the smog of Kansas City. So my father bought a beautiful, brightly painted green lumber wagon and built a covered wagon, and he fitted a mattress and a spring into that wagon and stowed everything that goes with camping underneath the mattress and spring. And we took off with a pair of young mules pulling the lumber wagon. Now, I don't think we made too many miles a day, but we were headed for north central Kansas, where my grandfather had pioneered.
Now, this was in
1904.
1904.
1904.
And you were 4 years old.
I was 4 years old. I remember I was so excited about that beautiful wagon, and I can remember how my father fixed that spring so carefully so that my mother could rest there. How many days it took us to get out to north central Kansas, I just don't know. And I don't know how we lived, but we must have lived alongside the road as we went, because I remember Papa packing a 2-burner coal oil stove, with a little point that held a gallon can of oil at the top. So we fixed our meals along the way and slept in the wagon.
Well, that's the earliest camping story I've ever heard.
Well, I remember it so distinctly, it doesn't seem like it could possibly be over 75 years old. That's right. And then, after stopping with my grandparents for a while, we started south because we were heading for the warm country, And we must have traveled along what is now Old 81, because we went due south from Clyde or Concordia down towards Oklahoma. And there's one thing I remember about being in Oklahoma that really is funny. I don't know if you're acquainted with what mules can do, but young mules can be pretty stubborn. And there had evidently been a shower of some kind, and there was a puddle on the road. And one of the mules simply sat down in the puddle, and he would not budge. And I can remember so well my father going up the hill to a farmhouse to try to get help. And what else happened, I don't know. But then we traveled on, evidently, the next day, and my father learned that the river that we were supposed to go across had quicksand in it, and he would not run the risk of taking his family through that. So he sold the whole outfit. We took the train to Los Angeles. And there, of course, was warm and sunshine. It wasn't the big Los Angeles that it is now. We spent some months there, and then we went to San Francisco. And believe it or not, we lived in what is now the elite part of San Francisco, Nob Hill. But it was just brownstone houses in those days. And I remember the room that we must have been sort of an efficiency apartment or something. I just remember that it was a big living room with a bay window. And when my mother was feeling better, she did beautiful needlework. And I do remember some strange things, but I remember how she made this particular piece. And I think it's so beautiful. But the pattern was on pink tissue paper. And she sewed this braid, I don't know if you can see it or not, this braid on, and then worked all this fine work, leaf work. And
the tissue paper pattern was what she followed.
She worked it on the tissue paper, and then after it was done, she tore the tissue paper away. And the linen is just as beautiful as it.
Yes.
As a child, I remember this being on our living room table. I don't remember ever seeing anything else on the living room table but this doily.
Well, that's a nice remembrance, and that's quite a story for a 4-year-old to remember.
Well, it's very vivid to me.
I think we have some pictures here, don't we, of when you were 4 years old.
This is when, just before we were taking off, my mother had made her blouse, and in those days they wore little collars, and that's a collar that she made. And I remember the color of that blouse. It was a soft green wool. And I always just loved the way she wore her velvet ribbon in her hair. My dress, she made that, and the ruffle is hand hem stitched with insertion. And then it was customary in those days to take pictures with hats and coats on, and there we are all ready to go. And she had made her suit, and I have one button of that suit.
Oh.
And she made my coat, which is a very pretty blue, and I remember I just loved that bonnet.
Oh, that's
because it had
fancy.
a frill in it. And I think it's rather interesting that the hat sat in place
with the bird feathers on it.
That's right. And this is a picture, must have been taken a little earlier, but I like this picture because it had my favorite doll, and I still have that doll. There again, you can see the fine handwork that my mother did, and she made the doll clothes too.
So
that doll, I still have that doll head, and it had real hair, real curly hair.
And that's your dog.
That's my dog, Tip.
Well, those are lovely remembrances. What kinds of things, after you got back to Kansas City from this big trip, what other kinds of things do you recall from childhood? What kinds of games did you play as a little girl?
Well, I remember one of the first things, my father started a home right next door to the house in which I was born. And I remember when he built the foundation and laid when the big boards were laid before they started to put up the 2x4s for the siding, I thought that was a wonderful platform to play on. That's all I remember about that house.
You sound like a tomboy.
But the neighborhood children, we had a lot of fun as neighborhood children playing under the street lights until 9 o'clock. We had a curfew at 9. And then everybody scattered and went home, and believe it or not, some of the most precious memories I have are of sitting on the front porch visiting with my father and mother in the evening. Now we don't even have front porches.
No, and we don't do that much talking to one another.
That's right.
That's right. What kind of games or toys did you have?
Well, I didn't have too many toys. I had this doll that I thought a lot of, and one Christmas I remember my mother made a complete outfit of clothing, an apron, little cover, calico apron, and a dress, Mother Hubbard dress, just like I had, out of the same material that I had. And she bought a little brass bed and fitted it with bedding and a new outfit for my doll. So that was my Christmas present. That's the biggest Christmas I remember. And that was about a year after we got back from this big trip.
When you think of being a little girl, who were the people that were important or that influenced you the most?
Well, my parents, of course. And then, of course, I went to Sunday school. We didn't have cars in those days. I walked to Sunday school, and Sunday school always meant a lot to me. And I loved my Sunday school teachers. And Sunday school material is a lot different now. But we learned the catechism, and I have a few cards here that I've cherished all through the years. We were given, each Sunday that we came, we were given little cards like this. And when we had gathered just so many, then we turned them in and we got another card like this. And I loved them, and I'd put them in a box and save them, and we'd just take them out and look at them.
They're so dainty and delicate.
Yes, yes.
One is in Swedish, with Swedish
That was
words.
the first one. That's the first one I ever remember receiving.
And the others are in English,
Yes.
little verses. Very lovely. You spoke about your grandparents to me. What do you recall about them?
Well, my grandparents moved to Kansas City in about 1911 or so, and they lived then next door to us in the house in which I was born. And my grandfather used to entertain me by the hour, telling about his childhood in Sweden. And he was so proud of the fact that he could ring the bell in the church belfry. And my grandmother sang quite well. And I remember how she used to sit in the rocker and sing Swedish little lullabies. And I can still remember some of them. But she never did learn to speak English, because when they came to this country, there was a community of Swedes that settled up here in Brantford, just like there was a community of Swedish people in Kansas City. In fact, there's still a Scandinavian club in Kansas City.
There is in Wichita.
Well,
Other
I don't
cities.
know about the other places, but I know there is one in Kansas City. But, and I belonged to the last confirmation class in our church that were confirmed in Swedish. And confirmation day was very meaningful to me. We were 24 in a class, 12 boys and 12 girls.
That's a large class.
Yes, it was a large class. I don't believe there are that many in classes nowadays.
No.
And we sang the song that has always meant a great deal to me in Swedish, from an old Swedish hymnal. Where are you going, my brother? Where are you going, my sister? And we're traveling forth to heaven. That's about the way you have to translate it, you know. Seems to me that the poetry and stories that we had were, a lot of them were about heaven. You don't hear Sunday school songs about heaven anymore.
No.
One of my favorite songs when I was a little girl was When He Cometh. I don't even know if that's in the Sunday school hymnal anymore. So there was a seriousness about our young lives, I think, that more serious maybe than youngsters seem to be nowadays, and yet that didn't mean we had a lot of fun.
Yes. Did you have brothers and sisters?
No, I had only the one sister, and my sister and I had been very close, and she also had she 6 years younger than I, so she didn't have quite the same experiences that I did.
What do you remember about starting school as a 6-year-old?
I had my first primer. I don't remember the first day of school, but I remember my first grade teachers. The teachers were very dear to me. And you know that sometimes I just wonder if people realize how much having a pleasant room and having good pictures on the wall mean to children. I can still remember the pictures of Washington and Lincoln and some of these lithographs that we see on the walls, and the teacher would always have a nice motto on the wall. At the beginning of every week, she'd have a motto. And another thing that I remember with a great deal of feeling are the few minutes in the morning when we had devotions in grade school. Of course, they don't do that anymore.
No.
But it's funny to say it, but I can still smell how the desk smelled when we put our heads down on the desk and prayed together the Lord's Prayer.
Uh-huh.
And then, of course, sometimes if we had been real good and done very well in our study, the teacher would take an extra 15 minutes and read us a story, a real good story, and we loved that.
Something that was continued from day to day, or
Yes, a continued story.
Yes. Uh-huh.
In those days, we had inkwells,
Yes.
you know,
Yes.
and my hair was always kind of curly, and I had a long curl in the back. And I remember one time, one of the boys that sat in front put my hair in the inkwell, so it took a little while to get rid of it.
I'm sure that was hard to wash out, wasn't it?
I don't remember.
When you started school, you said something to me about not speaking English.
I didn't speak English well until I went to school. No. We spoke Swedish at home all the time.
And how long did that last in your home?
Well, I spoke Swedish all the time. When I came home from school, we spoke Swedish.
Spoke Swedish.
And of course, because my grandparents living next door too, you know, we always spoke Swedish. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't, I had spoken Swedish most of my life.
Was that true even during your high school years?
Yes.
Until you went away to college?
Until I went away to college, yes, that's right. Of course, my children feel very badly that they don't know how to speak Swedish. But it was just different in those days. We carried on our conversation, and our home conversation, most of it was in Swedish.
Tell us about the Swedish school that you attended.
In the summertime, after school was out, then all the children in the church, Sunday school, would have a period of training. And I brought my, it's called the Läsebok, reading book, and it's pretty well worn. And I would judge from the handwriting in the front that I was in about the 3rd grade. But this was published in 1890. But I was noticing, and I remember that we learned how to read script as well as the regular reading, the regular print. And so that when I got to high school and studied German, I could read the German script very easily. In fact, I was the only one in the German class that could say, oh, eh, eh.
I like the way you can see your scholarly bent here, where everything has been underlined that you were studying. And I thought it was interesting back here to notice that in the more advanced part of the book, here's a picture of Abraham Lincoln. And you were learning English or American history from a Swedish book.
That's right. Well, it was stories and history, and then we had Bible study, and we had we learned hymns. I remember one of my teachers said, memorize hymns, because one of these days you're not going to be able to see, and you'll be glad that you know the words. And I have learned that that's true.
That's an interesting thing. We don't help children when they're little today to think about when they grow older.
No, that's right.
And what might be of help to them then. When did you begin to first feel like an adult?
You know, I just don't know. I think I was pretty much of an adult in high school. I took responsibility. I mean, I just felt responsible for, I tried my level best to make all ones. I wanted my parents to be proud of me. Mm-hmm. And I can still remember how my father's face would light up when he looked at my grade cards, and I had good grades, and I worked hard to please him. So I was pretty much of an adult when I was 15, 16 years old. Mm-hmm. And I've looked at pictures that I took in those days too, and they're all pretty sober. I noticed even my mother was not an old woman here, and you see how sober she is.
Sober looking,
and
yes.
her childhood pictures were sober.
Mm-hmm. But in other words, when you went away to college, you already felt like an adult.
Oh, yes, I was very much like
College wasn't a time of life where you were growing into that
No,
adulthood.
I should say not, but that was a wonderful thing. I remember when my father wanted to be sure that I had a good suitcase. I had one suitcase and a trunk. And I think about how the folks come now with their stereos and all sorts of
with
equipment.
a whole car full.
Whole car full. Well, he bought a nice leather suitcase for me, but it happened to be so heavy I had a terrible time to carry it.
So you came from Kansas City, and where did you go to college?
Here at Bethany.
Bethany.
And that was really a turning point in my life. Those were 4 wonderful years. And that first year here at Bethany, we had Army people on campus because of the camp up in Salina. And I remember the chapel services. In those days, they kept track of us. They marked whether we were present in chapel or not. And we used the little Army hymnal to sing from. And there is where I first learned to know the hymn, Jesus, Savior, Pilot Me. That wasn't in our hymnal, and I loved that song.
Now, this was 1917.
The fall of 1917.
Just
and
before.
I remember definitely, of course, sang in the Messiah. And I remember when they took the Messiah chorus to Camp Funston to sing for the soldiers there, and how the soldiers just packed that big auditorium and hung into the windows and heard us
How
sing.
big was the chorus in those days?
About 400. About 400. Mm-hmm.
Was that still when the chorus practiced in that oval building?
Yes, that's right. And in those days we had part practice, and I played for the altos part practice. We'd have a half an hour of part practice before we had the whole chorus get together. And I played that old organ there in the old, we called it auditorium, that octane. And those benches were just, hard as they could be, but everything was just packed.
Now, what was your major in college?
It was music. My mother always told me when I was a child, she said, I want you to learn to play the piano because then you'll always be welcome in any society. And as it happened, since I turned out to be a pastor's wife, it was a very handy thing to have. But I did want to be a nurse. Now, one of my girls is a nurse, so she inherited the
desire to do that.
That's right. But I've always loved music, and that was my major. Of course, when I was in college, the fine arts department was just like a separate school. I mean, the college people didn't have anything to do with the fine arts people, and we were just like a separate department. I'm glad now that it's merged altogether. I think that's a healthier way.
Now, you played the piano and you sang, and what else did you do?
Well, I didn't do much singing, but I got my degree, BM, they don't give that anymore, in piano, and a diploma in pipe organ, and a certificate in public school music.
So you could teach.
My first job was in Medicine Lodge, Kansas, the town that has been made famous by Carrie Nation. And I had a lot of fun in Medicine Lodge because, they took their music seriously there. We have track meets every year, and they were just as interested in winning first place in music as they were in winning first place in track or whatever sport. But I was just frightened to death the first year because here I was stepping into the shoes of a very experienced teacher.
And you'd have to get up with programs.
I should say I did. But, and the unfortunate thing was that several of the boys, the good singers, had graduated the year before. But everybody tried their best. So,
how did you feel being in a new community as a young single woman, out of college? I know if your job was kind of made you nervous, but how did you feel about making a place for yourself in the world?
I've always loved people, and I was fortunate in having some wonderful people to live with. And the teachers, there were several teachers staying in the same house. And the lady that opened up her home to us gave us breakfast, coffee and toast and juice every morning. And that gave us a chance to get acquainted. And it happened that the principal of the school was of the grade school, also roomed there. But I have to tell you an experience that really has meant a great deal to me all my life. And that was the first day of school. Before I went to school that morning, I received a letter from my mother. And we had an older uncle that had lived with us for about a year. And in that letter that my mother wrote, he had enclosed a little Bible verse written in Swedish. And it's from Philippians 4, "In nothing be anxious." And that was just like a voice from heaven to me the first day of school. That's always been a favorite.
That's a wonderful memory.
That is.
Did you do things in the community of Medicine Lodge while you were there as a teacher?
Yes, I did. It wasn't long until the Presbyterian pastor's wife and a friend came and called on me and urged me to come to the Presbyterian church. And there was no Lutheran church in the community, so I went to the Presbyterian church and felt very much at home. And, of course, it didn't take long until I was playing the piano there and helping with the choir, and then I organized the community chorus, which they had never had before. And Medicine Lodge was not such a large town at that time, but I think we were about 65 or so in the chorus. And that was it was a thrill for me, and I think they enjoyed it too. So I loved that little town, and there was a rapport with the students that I will never forget. I kept up with some of them even after I was married.
Now, I think you told me that you had a year of teaching in Kansas City, and then was it soon after that you got married?
Well, yes, I spent a little while in Kansas City, but I had to quit teaching there. But then I said I think the Lord had his reasons, because just about the time I had to quit teaching, our pastor became ill and needed help in the church. And after I had sort of recuperated from my experience in teaching, he asked me to come up and help in the church. And it was that following summer then that I was engaged to my husband, who was a pastor.
Well, tell us a little bit about where you met your husband and a little bit about your courtship days, because those are fun recollections.
That is really funny. I teased him as long as he lived about that, because, as I told you, I was a freshman when he was a senior.
At the college?
At the college, yes. But so he didn't really, I don't think he knew who I was that year. But anyway, he'd always stop here at Bethany on his way to the seminary in the fall. And it happened that one Sunday, for some reason or other, I happened to be pretty much in the public eye. I was substituting for Ellen Strom at the organ in Messiah Church. And I was playing for the Luther League at chapel, and I was chapel organist the next day, and he attended that. And we had a prayer circle that met on Saturday night, and I was there, and he was there. So he had seen quite a bit of Ethel during the weekend. And as I finished my organ practice on Monday, there were always a bunch of boys that gathered outside of the chapel doors and just visited. And as I came out the door to get ready to go over to the library for an hour study, he stepped out from the whole group and spoke to me and asked if he could carry my books. And I always did tell him. He didn't even remember my name was. He opened a book to see what my name was. I'm sure he did. Then he asked on the way over there if he wrote to me if I would answer. And I said, I'm pretty busy, but I'll try. But I waited a whole month to answer his first letter, so I don't know how in the world he kept on, but I guess it was meant to be.
Well, that's a fun story, Ethel, to hear about that.
Well, he was a great man, and I remember him being on the basketball team and the football team. He always loved sport.
And so then he graduated from Augustana Seminary before you got married?
Yes, he graduated in 21 from the seminary, and I graduated from Fine Arts here in 21. So, but then he got busy out in Salt Lake City, and he was almost too busy to write, and I was almost too busy to write. And in those days, they don't do like they do now, use the telephone. We never thought of using the telephone. No. But we managed somehow to get together. My sister has teased me so much. She said, I had more dates in 1 week than you had in all 3 years of courtship.
But it was enough.
That's right. And
so then you got married in Kansas City?
That's right.
And what was the date?
11th of February, 1925.
1925.
And those years, almost 46 years together, were the happiest years of my life.
And you call your husband Happy?
Happy, that's right.
That's
his brother, 16 months older than he, Amos Glad, he was called Big Happy, and my Happy was called Little Happy, but there wasn't that much difference. But for some reason or other, they did.
But now his full name was
Carl Arthur Glad.
Carl Arthur Glad.
That's right. But I've never called him anything but Happy. He's never been anything but happy to me, except when we visited the folks out. His folks lived out in northwestern Kansas. And of course, his mother and father spoke Swedish, and I couldn't call him Happy in Swedish, so then he was Carl.
Well, I think to have a pastor who's named Happy, it makes me feel good. He must have been a man who could relate to people.
He did.
If he had a nickname.
He did. And when we served a congregation in Geneva, Illinois, somebody had gone by the bulletin board and seen the bulletin board that said Carl A. Glad, pastor, with a comma after Glad. And they just placed the comma differently, and they said Carl, comma, a Glad pastor. That was in the Chicago Tribune. I had the clipping.
That's a good story.
Yes, it is.
Well, what do you recall of your honeymoon? Did you have a trip?
Oh, yes. We went to California, and he didn't tell me we were going to go until just shortly before we were married, and I was thrilled to pieces. So we went out to Denver and got acquainted with some relatives that I had never met, and then we went to his home, and I put on my bridal outfit so that his father and mother could see me as a bride. His sisters were attendants, his sisters and one brother, but they couldn't come. Then we went on to Denver and visited more relatives, and then on down to Los Angeles, stopped in Grand Canyon, and made the circle up to San Francisco, and then came back to Salt Lake City. And Salt Lake City was a wonderful place to begin our work because it was a mission field, really, supported by the church at large.
By the Augustana
Lutheran Church. And at the time, the minimum wage for a missionary on the home mission field was $1,800 a year. And then we took care of our own coal. We furnished a 10-room house with 3 coal stoves. That's the way we kept warm. And my husband was so anxious for the congregation to become independent that he told them he would take a $100 cut in salary if they would become self-supporting. So that's what we were making when we got married, $1,700 a year.
Tell me about your wedding dress. You said you took it to show that your husband's family.
Well, it was you know that in those days there were no wedding places where you could buy wedding dresses like you can now. And we were married in February, and my mother and I just scoured Kansas City, Missouri for a white dress. The only white dress we saw was an old crepe de chine tailored dress that had been left over from summer days. So I had to have my wedding dress made, and it was just a simple tailored satin dress, not quite floor length. That wasn't the style in those days. And with a simple veil with orange blossoms. And he wore his clergy. In those days, you see, the pastors had these clergy collars with the tabs. And I still remember how hard they were to take care of. to launder.
You had to do that the rest of your life.
No, not the rest of my life, because back in about 1930, they quit wearing those tabs and just wore the straight clergy collar. But I remember so well how hard it was to iron those things so that they'd stay in place and not flip up into his chin. Had to get just the right amount of starch into them.
We never know what little things are difficult to do when we don't have to try it ourselves.
That's right. But then in those days they had the regular preacher coats, But then in about 1930, the pastor started to wear the robes. And then the congregation had a little surprise on him on his birthday and gave him some of the money that helped to buy his robe.
His first set of robes.
Mm-hmm.
Well, how many years, if you were married in 1925, how many years did you live in Utah?
We moved. We were married in 25. He had been out there in 1920, the summer of 1920, as a student. And then they called him to be their permanent pastor. So we left in October of 29. So he had been there over 8 years. And he served not only the congregation in Salt Lake, but mining towns, camps, and all around Provo and Bingham Canyon, Eureka, and Ogden. For 6 years, he was the only Augustana Lutheran pastor in the entire state of Utah. And it just seemed that it was difficult to keep pastors in. But I enjoyed going with him to these various places. And Bingham Canyon, which is no more, was a very interesting place to go. And there he organized the confirmation class. And he had 13 students, and he could only locate one family that had a Bible. And so that he decided to send to the book concern for Bibles for each one of the children, and presented them to them at the beginning of their confirmation training. And I remember that little church so well. Held about 150 people maybe, and it was built right up against the mountain. And of course, I used to play the little reed organ there, and when I opened the window, I could touch the mountain just like I can touch the wall here.
Right out the window.
Right out the window, that's right. And when on Confirmation Sunday, I brought my choir from Salt Lake City, which I happened to be leader of at the time, out there to sing. And the ladies, we served the congregation. The miners in those days were most of them Swedish, Finnish people. I guess in the old country they did mining. And Bingham Canyon at that time was the largest open-cut copper mine in the world. And there was enough copper, and it was so easy to get at, that it took care of what it cost to mine the silver and gold that was in the hills. And because it was a low-grade copper, but it was so easy to get at. And the last time I visited in Salt Lake City, I wanted to see Bingham Canyon, and they said there is no more Bingham Canyon. They have dynamited away the mountain.
So the mountain is completely gone.
Completely gone. But at the time that we lived there, we always happened to have a lot of tourists in the summertime, And we'd take them out to Bingham, which was 30 miles from Salt Lake City. And we'd get out there by 4 o'clock in the afternoon when they had set dynamite. And the mountain, they had made terraces, I guess is the best way I can describe it. They began at the bottom and built terraces that held several railroad tracks. And then they'd blast away the wall, and a big shovel would come along and scoop up what had been blasted out and pour it in the cars, like our railroad coal cars are now. And then they'd shoot them through a tunnel to the other side of the mountain where there was a smelter. And they had gone so far that I think there were 13 levels when we left there. So you see, they were pretty close to the top. And there was one street in that town. It was so narrow that 2 cars could not pass, even the cars that we had in those days, which were considerably smaller. And that street was 7 miles long. and it had one fork that went off of that street. And houses were built upside the mountain, and the women didn't have any place to hang their washing outdoors, so they had pulley lines across Main Street. And the women that lived up at the other end of the street, they used to go to town through the mine shaft.
To get to the bottom.
To get to the bottom, until they had to happen to have an accident, and then they didn't let them go anymore. But I always enjoyed going to Bingham Canyon. And there was one home that I visited, or we visited quite often, and I remember that so well because they had a living room, a bedroom, and a kitchen. And of course, we always had to have coffee, you know.
Yes.
And she opened the kitchen door, and here was a little platform outside, and she opened the door, and her pantry was in the mountainside, just like we have caves up, you know, and that thing's kept cool there, of course. Mm-hmm. But always their windows were full of bright geraniums planted in tin cans, and there was a hunger for beauty in that little town because there was so much of ugliness mm-hmm. digging away. And on Confirmation Sunday, the women really outdid themselves. They brought all their blooming plants, and they decorated with fancy doilies, and it was just beautiful. And there were so many people that they were standing outside up the street about 2 blocks. People wanted to know what was going on.
Well, that's a wonderful story to think how important a day, confirmation,
yes.
could be in the lives of that whole
right.
community.
That's right, it was. But there are some sad things, too, about Bingham Canyon. I remember how dreadful it was when we had to take, you see, they were subject to consumption, minors' consumption. Mm-hmm. And the first ladies' aid that I attended, we met in the homes, and they would take out the furniture and put boards on chairs and so forth, and we sat around that. Of the 10 women that was there, I was the only one whose husband was living.
Oh, my goodness. Mm-hmm.
And I remember attending funerals, and how I just dreaded out at the cemetery when that we didn't have the fancy setups that we have nowadays, mm-hmm. hearing the rocks come down on the wooden mm-hmm. box of the casket.
You feel that there were more funerals
yes.
held when you lived there than in...
Yes, there were more funerals per capita, I would mm-hmm. say.
Yes.
But the Swedish-Finnish people are wonderful people, so warm and friendly. They had a little different way of speaking, and I had a little difficulty understanding them. It's a kind of a chopped-up Swedish.
Uh-huh.
Like, instead of saying kaffe, like we say coffee, they'd say kaff. Kaff.
Uh-huh. Not finish the word.
Not finish the word.
Now, were their children learning English?
Oh, yes, they learned English, but they spoke Swedish-Finnish, too.
Would they have had Swedish school or Finnish schools? Nothing like that?
No. They came over most of them came over from a certain area in Finland, but for Sweden, they didn't really want to be classed as Finnish. But right now I can't remember the name of the town, but there were most of them that came from that one area. They wanted to be considered Swedes. Mm-hmm.
Well, that's an interesting story to think of your husband being the only pastor in the whole state of Utah for the Lutheran Augustana Church.
That's right, for 6 out of the 8 years that he was there. Mm-hmm. But we went to Eureka, which is about 100 miles south of Salt Lake City, a couple times a year. And I remember at Christmas time, there was a Sunday school of about 35 or so. We met in the Methodist church, and we selected pieces for the children to speak. And then we packed our suit. I sent them on ahead, so they learned them. And then we packed our suitcases full of boxes of hard candy and decorations and things like that. So I fixed up the altar there, and he built a fire in the stove. And we had a crowded church for the Sunday school program. Oh, and I have to tell you, but also every other Sunday we went to a little place about 12 miles south of Salt Lake City, which was called Sandy. That was also a community of Swedish Finns that were farming there. Some of them had been in the mines, but they were farming. And I asked one time how large their farms were, and they said 10 acres. Well, to me, coming from Kansas, 10 acres was not very much of a farm, but they made use of every foot, and they specialized in chickens and good eggs. And I remember when we lived there, they said the Utah eggs brought the highest price in the New York market.
And they shipped them all the way to New York.
That's right. I remember they said that they charged $1 a dozen for eggs, Utah eggs. So.
Well, now, when your husband left Salt Lake City, was there any farewell celebrations?
Oh, yes, I should say the congregation gathered and had a wonderful. We were just like one big happy family. We didn't want to leave, and they didn't want us to leave. But it seems that there was a special call that came from Geneva, Illinois. And there's a little story in connection with that always has touched me too. Geneva was a congregation of over 500 and had a good-sized Sunday school just 30 miles west of Chicago. And it was one of the first congregations organized in the Illinois Conference. Well, the conference president had given the vice pastor a list of about 20 names to read to the board when they were going to call a pastor. And my husband's happened to be about fourth on the list. And there was a man by the name of Ethel Carlson, who told me this story in Swedish. And he said, "I knew that you were going to come, Mrs. Glad. I knew that you were going to come, because when Pastor Ekstrom, David Ekstrom from St. Charles, which is just 2 miles north of Geneva, led the meeting, when he started to read the names, he got to your husband's name, and there was a kind of a hush that fell over the board meeting, and they didn't even finish reading the names. And in Swedish, he said, 'Det klappte I bröstet.' He had a feeling in his heart that my husband was going to be the next pastor. They didn't call him for an interview. They had never seen him. And yet he became their pastor for 16 years.
My goodness. You were telling me about an incident in the community of Salt Lake City as your husband was leaving, a community sort of celebration with the Mormons?
Yes. Oh, yes, that's right.
I thought that was very interesting.
Yes. I've always been very proud of the fact that he was selected by the Swedish people to present a gift to the Crown Prince of Sweden, who visited Salt Lake City. And my husband always cooperated with the Mormons when it came to community affairs, but of course not in the church work. But when the Crown Prince was there, that was in 1926, my husband was the speaker. And we didn't have loudspeakers in those days either. But his voice carried very well, and it was held out in Liberty Park in Salt Lake City. And a girl dressed in a Swedish costume was holding a tray made of Utah marble, decorated with Utah silver and gold. And the beehive is the emblem used out there, and there were gold beehives around it. And on that platter were 2 crocs dug up from the cliff dwellings of southern Utah. And that was presented to the Crown Prince. Well, when we left, one of the professors at the university, who was Swedish, Mr. Forsberg, arranged a very nice dinner for us. And my husband was presented with a bowl dug up from the cliff dwellings of southern Utah. So I thought that was quite an honor to have the Mormon people do that for him. So we had a Mormon, what they call a ward house. You see, when Brigham Young laid out Salt Lake City, he laid it out in blocks of 10 acres each and told them to get to work. Each man, each head of the family had their 10 acres. And then now Salt Lake City is laid out in the same way church-wise. And there are ever so many what they call ward houses. The temple is not used for church services, and the tabernacle, you see, is not used for anything but large gatherings. That's where the organ recital is. But these ward houses would compare with our churches, and we had a ward house just next door to our little church. There was a little cottage between the two. But they had, as some you may know about this, they always send out missionaries 2 by 2, and they volunteer to go. And maybe their wives have to take in washing while they're gone. They're not given any salary. So they were sent off by a benefit dance in the basement of the ward house. Many are the Saturday evenings when we heard the band playing in the ward house. I used to think that was such a strange way of sending away missionaries.
Yes, with a dance. Now, were some of your children born in Utah before you moved?
Yes, the 2 eldest were born in Utah. Paul was born in 1926, and he's a professor at Norman, Oklahoma now. And Esther Marie was born in Salt Lake City the 2nd of October of 1928. And she's located in Sacramento, and her husband is in educational work in the schools of California.
So when you moved to Illinois, you had 2 small children with you.
2 small children, 3 and 1.
Well, what are some of the outstanding memories that you have of your 16 years in Illinois?
Oh, that was also a thrilling period. The church was in the process of introducing the English language. There was still Swedish being preached there also. And so my husband had 2 services every Sunday, English and Swedish. And that was really a pretty heavy program. And in those days, we also had evening services. That was a heavy schedule for one man.
And how long did the services in Swedish continue?
You mean how many years?
How many years?
Well, up until the time that we left, because there was quite a large constituency that still preferred the Swedish services. And then for some periods he'd have be vice pastor of another congregation. And I remember one Sunday when he spoke 7 times and he was exhausted.
Oh my, his voice would give out.
That's right, he had a good voice, but he had taught Bible class, he had had English services and Swedish services, and gone to Batavia, Illinois, which is just 3 miles away, and had a special service down there, it's funeral service, and they wanted a sermonette in Swedish as well as English. Then there was a silver anniversary, and he went there to give a greeting, and then had to come home and have evening services after that. So that was a big day.
Now you had other children born in Geneva?
We had 2 children in Geneva, Illinois. Harold was born in 1931, in February of 1931, and he is supervisor in physical education in the west side of St. Louis. He has about 30 schools under his supervision. And Doris was born in 1934, December of 1934, and she's married to a man who is in intelligence work with the government. And they have had to spend much of their married life overseas, in Germany, Bremerhaven and Marburg. Not Marburg. Right now I can't think of it, but anyway, that's
but in Germany.
They're in this country now.
Yes.
They're in this country now.
And how many grandchildren do you have?
I have 12 grandchildren, 7 boys and 5 girls.
Oh, that must be marvelous to
Yes,
watch them
right.
growing up.
And I'm very proud of them. I have one grandson that is studying to be a doctor up in, he's in medical school in Madison. He got a grant to Johns Hopkins to get his PhD before he's getting his MD. And I have another grandson that wants to be a doctor, and he's taking his medical exams now this spring out in California. So, and the three boys out in California are really interested in music. They all play instruments very well. But unfortunately, none of the other grandchildren have much use for it for some reason or other.
What are some of the memories that you have of life in the parsonage when the children were little?
Oh, I remember I had to be prepared for almost anything in Geneva because that was the county courthouse. And people would come out from Chicago to be married.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember sometimes the groom would come to the door and ask my husband if he could perform a wedding. And we had a very large living room. It had been a parlor and a sitting room. I could seat 30 people in the living room.
Uh-huh.
Well, of course, the children used that for playground part of the time in the wintertime.
Yes.
And I used to scramble sometimes to get things in order for the weddings.
Mm-hmm.
But that was interesting. We met a lot of people there because of that being the area. And everybody knew about our church. It was such a beautiful church, a beautiful high spire that you could see for a radius of 100 miles, like Bethany's spire.
What were the things that were expected of you as a pastor's wife in those days?
Oh, we were just a team. I remember very well when we first moved there, this missionary society was being conducted in Swedish, and one lady had been president quite a long time. And she wanted me to become president of the missionary society, and I said, well, I can't do it in Swedish. Well, just be president. We'll take it in English. Mm-hmm. So I worked with the Missionary Society then, and I've always enjoyed working with people. And when we first started, or when we came there, it was just like a little devotional service. But it so happened that I thought a missionary group should be definitely missions. Mm-hmm. And we studied about our mission fields, India and China and Africa, and I tried to make it as graphic as possible so that I would have maps and posters and things to add to the atmosphere. I remember so well one time when Doris was a little girl, about 3 years old or so, she was so busy drawing on the piano bench, and I said, "What are you doing, my dear?" And she said, "Oh, I'm just making missionary programs."
Well, Ethel, I think that we're just about out of time this afternoon. Let's leave your life story in Geneva for now and come back another day to have the second session in this life review.
Well, this has been lots of fun.
Well, I've enjoyed it also.
Well, you know what they say about old people. They
What's
love
that?
to reminisce.
Well, it's been very, very valuable, I'm sure, and very enjoyable. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for listening.